before we kick things off. But to those who have joined us, welcome and thanks for joining us today. This is the second webinar that we're running, one of the three, as you can see on the screen. Last week we talked a bit more about the business case or the use cases behind server-side, people who are sort of thinking about whether it's the right thing for them or not. And I think some of that will overlap in what we talk about today. This is not just going to be purely technical, but what we want to do today is speak a bit more about the practical considerations of how you actually implement the tool. So I've got a few people joining me to talk through their experiences. But before we get started, we should make it clear. I mean, I assume everyone who's joined this session knows what server-side testing is, and we're not going to do much of a dummies. We expect you all know what it is, but just to make sure we get out of the way and be clear, we're talking about technologies that allow us to deliver variations or experiences, tests at the server level rather than through the client browser, which is traditionally how a lot of A/B testing, CRO, optimization, personalization has been done. We are going to talk through a few different topics, but before we do, we just wanted to get to know everybody. Now, I'm not going to ask everyone on the webinar to introduce themselves. It's more when Nelson and Elliot and I were talking about this topic, we felt that the answers that we gave to certain questions would depend on who we're talking to and who the audience is. I think we'd love to hear from everyone who's connected today, a little bit about them in terms of what department they're from, what stage they're at in their experimentation and why they're here today. So we've got a few polls. I'm going to start sharing now. If it isn't already on your screen on the right-hand side, there should be a little menu for the poll section, and you should see 3 questions popping up. And we'd really love your answers to tell us a bit more about who you are. Would you help us tailor our answers? This really, as I say, we traditionally in optimization and CRO, we've been talking to marketing people. That seems to have changed a lot in the last few years. We're talking a lot more to product people, engineering people, all sorts. And also, people who've been coming to these webinars so far at a various range of stages of their journey. Some are just interested. Some people are actually already doing it and just want to hear some other people's stories. So yeah, if you could take a little bit of time to answer those polls, that'd be really useful, and everyone can see them, so it helps us to tailor our answers as we go through. So hopefully I've done it right. We've got all 3 there. Yes. Okay, brilliant. So that's some of the logistics. Just before I introduce Nelson and Elliot, a few more things just to say. This is going to be a very conversational event today. We've got a few slides really just to prompt the conversation, but really I'm just going to be asking Nelson and Elliot a few questions, relatively informal. We have got some time at the end for a Q&A, so we'd really appreciate any questions you have in the chat portal on the right-hand side. If you could just pop questions through as they pop into your head throughout the session, and at the end we're going to try and put 5 minutes aside at the end of the session to answer some questions. And also, if we run out of time, Nelson and Elliot have both said they're quite happy to follow up with people or have separate conversations following today. So we'll move on to introductions first. And Elliot, maybe do you want to just say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. As you can see, my name is Elliot Cranmer. I'm a solution engineer for AB Tasty. I guess my role is working with prospects and clients, understanding what their current experimentation journey is, understanding if either client-side or server-side testing and experimentation will be a good fit for their business, and if it's going to be something they'll start in the near future or perhaps somewhere down the line. A little bit of a background about myself. I've got a computer science master's degree, so I've definitely sort of come from an engineering background, although probably taken a step back from any actual development work in recent years. Always worked for software companies, previously financial and security sectors, now obviously optimization and experimentation. Great to meet everyone.
Thanks, Elliot. And Nelson, I mean, I know you, maybe.
Thank you, Mark. Hi everyone, I'm Nelson. I'm the CTO at Creative CX. So I've been with Creative CX for 3 years now, so since it all started. Yeah, very excited to be with you guys today. Just a bit of a background about myself. So I've been in the experimentation field for about 8 years now, working with a variety of tools, but also across many verticals. So really excited to be with you guys today and talk a bit more about server-side testing.
Great. Thanks, Nelson. I think before we get into some of the more technical aspects of it, we're going to relive a little bit of what we talked about last week, but maybe expand on it. So I can see a few people who've joined today were in last week's session, but for everyone else's benefit. But last week we really talked through the use cases that drive the decision to move to server side. I think, part of the reason we started this webinar series came from our experience at Creative CX with customers coming to us with maybe one use case, saying we think that server side might help us solve this one problem. And as with most kind of things like this and use of new technology, we really have spent a lot of time trying to get people to expand their thinking to more than just one use case. I think just for the long-term success of a piece of technology or a change in process, it's important to think more than one sort of singular objective. So I think on the screen here, we've got a handful of use cases that by no means an exhaustive list. Last week, I think we picked 4 primary ones that we'd had experience of. And I thought just before we get into some of the more detail, it'd be good to just talk to both of you a little bit about some of the use cases that you've come across that you found interesting and some of the most common use cases you experience with the clients you work with. And maybe Nelson, if you could just give us some examples there of what you've come across.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I think it was quite interesting. So in a previous webinar, we talked a little bit about feature management. And I think this is a vast topic. And it certainly helps a lot of businesses get started from a progressive delivery of features and products. One of the areas that we've seen that customers are finding really useful to test is chatbots. So chatbots in terms of products are becoming quite a prominent product, but not only chatbots but also algorithms. The algorithms actually power chatbots. Page redesign. So redesign is again another area where a lot of customers are using server-side experimentation for, but also new functionalities. So search and filtering. So we have seen a lot of those cases coming through. In terms of performance, again, testing page performance on a new redesign, I think that's a very powerful feature. But then, we have seen a lot of use cases where customers want to test new API calls or new microservices, or, for example, introducing new catalog services to power their products on the website. So those are just some of them. I also want to highlight algorithm testing. I think that's really powerful. Again, we have seen a lot of customers wanting to test different types of recommendations. Catalog service, but also machine learning algorithms. And I think this is becoming a very popular use case nowadays.
Thanks, Nelson. Elliot, are there any others that we haven't put on the screen there, or anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, those are all definitely common things that will come up in the discussions we have. I think very sort of on a general level, you can kind of bucket them into who you're talking to. If you're speaking to someone from marketing or optimization, it'll be a very different sort of scope and scale of the testing as opposed to speaking to a product team. The marketing optimization team are going to be coming from a background of running a client-side tool. They know the value and the benefits of client-side testing, but they've hit a wall for whatever reason, right? And so when they've hit that wall, the examples will either be, okay, the scope has extended beyond the website, so they want to do the same level of kind of optimization and testing on website, but they want to do it now on an app or a different software. And as soon as you're looking at going off website, you can't rely on a client-side tool. You need to look at a server-side tool. And so those actual tests themselves are actually going to be very small. They're going to be just, for example, a button, changing the text and color of a button, but for an app as opposed to a website. The other type or scale test that they will be doing is going to be where it's something larger, it's something bigger than a client-side tool can facilitate. For example, pricing or a redesign or a new algorithm, all the things that are mentioned on the screen there. When you want to do these with a website, a client-side tool will have its limitations, and that's where these teams are coming to us and going, look, we've almost like maxed out the value in client-side testing. We want to go bigger. We want to test an entire new redesign, and that can happen from getting more analytics, getting more insights, running so many client-side tests that they know something needs to change and something big needs to change. And so that's your marketer, your optimization team. From a product team, they're coming because as all product managers, there are demands for them to be more agile, to have more releases, to ship more code, to make changes more often. And with that, it's great. You get better and faster products, but you also have a higher level of risk. as you're releasing code, there is more chance of bugs, there's more chance of negative user impact. And so for them, the value is having a tool that can manage every single change as a flag. Those changes or those flags can be tested against one another. They can be turned on, they can be turned off. You can roll them out in a phased way. You can have automatic rollbacks. And so, yes, they're going to be the bigger changes you see there. They are going to be a new algorithm or an entire new redesign or new feature, a new functionality. But the product teams want to be able to test their work. And I think that's sort of how I would generalize it.
Great. Thanks, Elliot. Yeah, I think we're probably in each webinar that we do, we'll end up talking about use cases, because I think they are the kind of root of it all, the foundation of it all. And I think, although we're going to talk a lot today about the how to do the technical bit, I think there's also some elements when we discussed this. I think Nelson, you and I were talking just earlier today about, obviously you probably start at the use cases, but I think there's some other business considerations. Even if your role is purely technical, some other considerations that you need to go through before you make a start on that technical component. So maybe, Nelson, if you could just talk through some of the business considerations you think are important.
Yeah, 100%, Mark. So I think, so we talked extensively about use cases. So again, I think it's really important to understand how server-side experimentation is going to be used across the business. And I think that's really, really important. Is the business looking to just use server-side experimentation as a means to actually launch feature flags, just to do experimentation or feature experimentation? Now, we have seen some businesses adopting a single strategy, just wanting to do feature flags or just wanting to do experimentation. Again, establishing as to how the experimentation platform is going to be used across the business, I think that's fundamental. The other point I really want to highlight is there an existing culture of experimentation within the business? And I think this is fundamental. Okay, now, if you guys already have an experimentation culture within the business, whether that's just front end or a level of feature flagging using another tool, we need to be aware of that. Okay, is there going to be an impact once we start rolling out features or experiments using a server-side platform? Another area I really want to highlight is team structure. Okay, so how is the team structured across the business? I think this is very, very important. I mean, we have seen some businesses having, core products and then different teams within that specific product, and then multiple squads, and each squad adopting its own process. Okay, so having visibility as to how the business or the teams across the engineering team are actually structured, it's really important. Okay, skill sets. So what are the skill sets that we have available across those teams? Okay, this is going to be really important because let's imagine we want to start testing with a microservice. Okay, so who is the correct team that we need to approach to start doing that? Okay, the last point I want to cover is current processes. Again, as I mentioned in my previous point, we have worked with several businesses where, sometimes they're small teams, sometimes they're larger teams. So understanding how those teams operate would really help, the different teams understand how can we later on embed an experimentation program effectively across those teams as well.
Thanks, Nelson. Yeah, I think that I'm always scared that we're going to repeat ourselves a lot on the culture piece, because I think it came up a lot last week. I think it will come up next week's session. For people who are in the optimization world, it's probably something that's a little bit tiring to hear it again and again because it's talked about everywhere. But I think we spoke about it last week. The thing with server-side, why it's even more important, is just the range of people who are involved. I think when we're talking about a client-side testing tool, you could effectively work with a very small team within a business. So you only need to align a handful of people who all have the same KPIs and the same bosses, I guess. Whereas we're really expanding this out to much broader teams who have different objectives, different priorities. So it is key. Elliot, I don't know if you wanted to add anything more to that.
I mean, exactly what you said. It's all about really the culture and having that idea of culture experimentation. One thing that always comes up is you need to have buy-in across the business. One team, like the marketing team, can't go and go, hey, we want to do server-side testing. Even like the marketing team, if they have some developers available, they can't do it. You need to have buy-in from senior management. You need to know that there's going to now be development resource that is focused entirely on optimization, experimentation, perhaps wasted resources, But yeah, you'll need buy-in from the whole business when you're trying to do this. As you said, client-side tool, you chuck the tag on the site, you can manage it with 2 or 3 people. With server-side, every test needs to be planned. You need to structure it. You need to have resources. It's a whole bigger thing.
Yeah. It's not as we talk there. I'm conscious that we're talking about, it is difficult. I think part of the purpose of this webinar and these series is first of all to make it clear that it's not a silver bullet that fixes all problems, but also I think hopefully by talking through these and thinking up front, it doesn't become a nasty surprise. I think for me personally, seeing some businesses who've gone in with a single use case, who've gone to solve one thing, some of these challenges we're talking about now have been found too late. They've been found out once it's already been spent, the money's been spent, or it's been implemented, or it's failing for one reason or another. So I think the main thing is to bring this forward in everyone's thinking to make sure it's considered before we get into it. And I think that probably leads fairly well onto the next component where we were talking, and we've thought of this really in a linear path in terms of use cases and business cases and considerations is kind of leading up to the decision to move forwards. And then when we're about to move forwards, maybe selected a tool, the next thing we were talking about there is the technical considerations that go into how you're going to implement whatever tool you've selected. So I think, Nelson, when we talked this morning, just when we were running through in advance of this about, I think you mentioned sort of around the architecture and the data. I don't know if they're one and the same or if they're 2 separate parts. Maybe you could come in a bit more.
Yeah, 100%, Mark. So I think, having the business considerations in place, how the tool is ultimately going to be used across the business, how the teams are split, and what are the core skill sets across the business. That's the first part. The next part is understanding the technical landscape that we have in place. Okay, so having a good understanding of the architecture. Okay, we have worked with Creative with various types of architectures, whether that's monolith, cloud architecture, distributed architecture, are there microservices involved? Again, just having a visual representation of that architecture tends to help a lot, because that's literally the map or the visual map as to how the SDK is going to potentially be implemented across that architecture. The other point I want to highlight is data. So data is crucial from a continuity point of view, but also from a velocity point of view. So again, understanding the data architecture across the business is really, really important. Okay, we have seen some businesses using data warehouses alongside analytics. Again, having an understanding of who's managing those architectures is crucial, but also how does the data flow in its current state at the moment. That would really enable us to kind of draw in and have a complete picture as to how ultimately the SDK should be implemented.
Thanks, Nelson. I think, and Elliot, you were talking when we spoke last week about it was about the understanding how the data flows, to Nelson's point, but also a bit more around kind of what is possible and where some things that might be overlooked, I think was your point. In terms of...
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Again, it comes down to the scope of the testing. You need to understand the architecture, which systems are connected, which servers are speaking to other servers, how the databases impact, and then look at the scope of what you're trying to achieve. Is it just going to be front-end changes, which they'll require developers, but it won't have such a bigger impact? If it's going to be more of a back end or structural change, you're going to need to have front end development teams, back end teams. So really understanding what you're trying to achieve, so that when you then know the architecture, as Nelson said, having some sort of visual map of that is great, because then you can see all the different points, all where the data is flowing, and understand, okay, this test or this experiment is going to impact these components here. We need to be prepared for that. We need to know what the impact will be. So yeah, having that overall picture is going to be great. Other things to consider is, what's your coding language? What's the software or the website built in? Is there an available SDK with the tool you're using that's going to be appropriate to use that? Or do you have to kind of use the native API and build the methods themselves? Will the SDK be implemented client side or server side? So there's a lot of things to consider, and I think that is obviously where we have sometimes difficulties with users coming from a client-side testing tool to a server-side testing tool. They understand, it needs to be built with code. They think, hey, we can just write some new code and launch the test, right? Well, it's not that simple. As Nelson said, there are so many things you have to consider before you even start writing code for the changes. So it can be a long time in setting up before you get your first test.
Yeah, and I think that leads. I think the next thing we're going to talk about is the actual implementation steps. But I think So that's that technical architecture, that landscape. I think, Nelson, you said landscape in terms of like having almost a diagram. I personally have been involved in a few similar exercises where when we've asked for a diagram of the technical architecture, there isn't one, or if there is one, it's a few years old. And it's been amazing actually sitting in a workshop with people and just drawing on a whiteboard, and people go, oh yeah, and we've got that thing there, and that probably needs to be updated with this, or that isn't ready in real time, or it's a batch process. And there's a lot more. I mean, again, without trying to turn this into a big scary exercise, there's a bit more consideration into actually drawing out that map, having that plan so that we understand where we sit within the architecture. And I think that leads on to some of the points you were just bringing, Elliot, there around the implementation considerations in terms of, I think you mentioned around whether we're going to go with SDKs or APIs. There's a whole long list of different considerations here, I think.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there are so many things to consider, the ones I mentioned before. I mean, other things, if you kind of break down the different list of things to consider, one of the key ones is going to be about the user ID, right? Every user that's involved in an experiment needs to be tracked, so you know what they're doing, which variation they're in, what they're seeing, what their conversions are. So you need to associate them with a user ID. So it's like, okay, how do you generate that user ID? How are you going to store it? How are you going to map it to the user? What's that value going to be? What if the user comes from different devices? Are you going to try and do cross-device tracking? And unfortunately, there is no very simple one-size-fits-all approach to user ID and tracking it. It really depends, again, going back to the technical considerations. What's the architecture? What are the data points? How can we map that to the user? But yeah, the user ID is, again, probably one of the first things you should really consider about before you've even built the flags and built the test. How are you going to know that user gets that one experience and that we can track what that user is doing?
Yeah.
And then the second big point will be, as I just mentioned, the flags and the scope of the flags. Again, you need to consider what the test is trying to achieve. And then when you're building these flags, like, can they be, when I say flags, I mean, the code modifications, can they be reused? Can they be turned off? If you're part of the optimization team and you're wanting to do more visual changes, these flags that they built, can they receive different flag values? Can they receive different strings to change the color and the text themselves? And thus, you don't have to go back to development every single time you want to build a new test. You can get some autonomy and then speed up the process of testing. For a product team, it's about, right, when you've built this huge modification, this new algorithm and this new product redesign, and you're testing it, it's like, can you turn it off? Can you push it live? And if and you test it and it fails, then can you then turn it off? If you've added new columns or new tables to the database, there can be actual real considerations and issues with turning things back off. And this all needs to be thought out before. And when you build these flags, knowing and accepting that a lot of the time they may fail, a test may fail, but it doesn't mean all the code is wrong. It maybe means that 90% of that code was great. There's just some tweaking that we need to do with the 10%. And so can the code and the flags be modified quickly rather than the whole thing having to be rebuilt?
Right. Thanks. Yeah. And Nelson, I think on this topic, I think there was quite a few points that we discussed around this. And I know, Nelson, you lead a lot of our server-side implementations for our clients. And I think, this is where I stop pretending that I'm technical enough to understand it. And I think I get about as far as SDK and API, and then I say, Nelson.
That's fine. That's fine, Mark. But yeah, Elliot, thank you for that. I think, user IDs, I just want to go back to user IDs. I think it was a very good explanation there. So user IDs, this is an area where we see a lot of businesses making some huge mistakes. So they need to be consistent throughout the user journey, and they cannot mutate. So if a user lands onto a website with user ID 111, should they log in, that user ID needs to be exactly the same. It cannot change. We have seen businesses using session IDs. Session IDs, they will only last for 30 minutes. Obviously, we don't want to change experiences for users and potentially making heavy bills, because we would need to make additional calls to get an activation or decision back from the experimentation platform. Another huge consideration I want to talk about is the SDK type, and this is again really, really important. Just having a good understanding, a decision made locally on your server, or do we need to make an API call? Okay, is the SDK just going to be implemented on the server, or do we need an SDK on the front end as well? So typically with single-page applications, especially server-side rendered applications, what we see nowadays is that the application is fully rendered on the server, returned back to the client, and then for the next three pages, then maybe we do not have an additional network call or server call. So in those instances, we may need to install an SDK on the front end as well, because we may need to activate an experiment, as soon as the application is fully rendered. The other aspect I want to talk about very quickly is what are the core metrics that businesses really want to track, okay? Having a good understanding of what those core metrics are, it's really, really important, and make sure they are fully implemented and validated as part of the validation and deployment strategy. The other one is core audiences. So making sure that you do have a good understanding how we're going to map core audiences should you need to actually target specific audiences within your feature flags or experiments, okay? Typically, we would be using a user profile service. We tend to look at those in good detail just to validate whether that information about the user is fully available there. The other area I want to talk about is integration. So making sure we've got our core integrations in place. So as part of the technical considerations, we talked a little bit about having a good understanding how the data flows across the business. So how we're going to integrate our experimentation platform, whether that's a data warehouse or an analytics platform, how is that going to be achieved as well? The other thing I want to talk about is in some instances, or most instances, you need loggers in place. So logging systems would allow for debugging practices. So, engineering teams, as they build features, or experiments, they would want some sort of mechanism to assist them as to whether, a metric has been fired or they bucked it into that specific feature successfully or not. The other area I want to talk about is error handling. So a lot of SDKs and APIs, so some of them, they do have error handling attached, some of them not. But we do always recommend that, companies do build their own error handling systems. Just should an error occur on a server, we handle that successfully as well. The other area I want to talk about is making sure, SDKs that are created or installed on the back end on your servers booted almost immediately. So we have seen some instances where SDKs are made available after the header, and then there's been a use case where we really want to test in the header, but actually we do not have the SDK available. So we really want to make sure that the SDK is fully available across the whole application to avoid scenarios like that as well. So,
right. Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a topic that I know I've been involved in some of the kickoff sessions where there's a lot more detail, and obviously it also depends on the technical environment that we're working within as well. But I think, like a lot of these, we're trying to keep this to a 1 hour session. So I think I might have said at the beginning, but Nelson and Elliot are both available to follow up if people want to go deeper into these topics.
There's actually one thing I would add to that, and it's, obviously Nelson listed all the technical things to consider. From the the non-sexy stuff, it's just the things like documentation. There's so much work and development and coding gone into that. What happens if your lead developer leaves the company? Are you going to know what's happening there? So documentation, I know it's boring, but you have to make sure that everything is in place. More people understand what it is. The naming convention of your audience streams, your flags, everything is in place. It's logical and it's documented. We've seen like horror stories of hours and hours of development resources and work be completely thrown away because the person that built it left and the new person has no idea what's going on. And it's just, if it's not documented, you can't use it.
Yeah, a really good point. And I think, as I probably mentioned already as well, we are talking about having lots of different teams involved as well. So even, not just that scenario of someone getting hit by a bus or leaving the company, is more appropriate, but in the scenario where if the documentation is not there, the handover between teams is just going to become really arduous and onerous, and and it just adds time if everyone has to be in every meeting in order to understand what's going on. So having a clear kind of chain of documentation and workflow.
Yeah, exactly. It may seem like it's adding time at the time you're doing it, but in the long run, it will save you time, save you effort, and make it easier for adoption of server-side testing. Yeah.
So I think that was I'd already teased the next slide really, where we're starting to talk about deployment. So I think we've talked through kind of understanding, first of all, the architecture, getting that picture on the whiteboard, or if it already exists, of what your technology looks like, understanding the flow of data and ownership of data and rights, etc. A little bit about some of the considerations of how you would actually implement the toolkit. The next bit really is how you actually roll it out, the deployment considerations. So I think, Nelson, I don't know if you could talk through, from your experience, some of the kind of key things to consider and ways to work through this process.
Yeah, 100%, Mark. Yeah, so I think, we have, at least in my experience, I've seen, this part been left out in a lot of instances. And this is why I wanted to bring it to today's, to everyone's attention, just because deployment, having a deployment strategy for the SDK is key. So making sure that deployments are staged, completely staged, so they actually go through the different environments. So some businesses, they might have development, staging, pre-prod, and then ultimately production. Just rolling it out through the different environments and validating every key aspect of that implementation is key, okay? Validating whether the data is flowing into your experimentation platform, your audiences are set up correctly and being targeted correctly, no additional activation calls have been made, and as you progress through the different environments, once you get to live, that's the real one. So ultimately, that's when you're actually going to validate the whole implementation with live users. We always suggest launching an AA experiment just to validate whether, with more traffic, whether the data is flowing, one, into the experimentation platform, but also across your data platforms as well. Having that validation strategy across each touch point, I think it's crucially important, and ascertaining that right at the beginning, it's key. And the last one I want to talk about is data alignment. I think this is a massive topic, and again, we have seen businesses with different data architectures. Some businesses wanting to align data with data warehouses, but also with analytics. We have seen data science teams obviously very aligned to data warehouses, finance team data warehouses, but then we got marketing teams wanting to actually have data aligned there. So getting a compromise and understanding what are the discrepancy levels should be across the different platforms is key. So I think my point there is just make sure you do have a strategy as you actually roll it out across the different touch points.
And is there one way has it been different for each client for you in terms of like how has it been sort of like big bang versus sort of slow phases? Yeah. Or is it... So
we have witnessed that. So we have witnessed instances where we haven't been too close to the whole implementation, and it was literally released from development into production. And we've actually found out that there was additional calls being made, and actually, that was costing clients a lot of money. So we had to roll everything back and actually assess where the problem was, and then implement that validation strategy. So we always suggest making sure you do have a strategy in place when you actually roll out an SDK.
And sorry, Elliot, before I cut you, just Nelson, just to get on that. I mean, where does that normally sit within the business? Is that talking with the IT teams to
typically within IT teams, yeah.
And Elliot, is there anything you would add to the whole thing around?
No, I mean, Nelson works far more hands-on with me and explains it great. I would agree and kind of reiterate, like, the validation is so important. I mean, it sounds obvious, but you don't want to rush these things. So take time, have resources available that will do every step of the release. They'll QA it properly, validate there are no false API calls or anything unexpected, to make sure that what you're doing is going to work. I would just reiterate that.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we've kind of whipped through that quite quickly. I think one of the things we wanted to come back to, which we've already mentioned at the top, really, was the culture piece. I think I already said it's a bit of an overused term, but I think we've all mentioned already that it's critical and important. I think in terms of why it's more important to server side, maybe Nelson, probably from your experience, because you've seen it happen like in lots of different companies. I mean, what does it mean to you, first of all? Other than a bit of a buzz topic, what's the difference between
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, Mark. So, I mean, to me, culture of experimentation is how do we actually accelerate whatever we do from a server-side perspective, within across engineering teams, right? I mean, there is a broader picture of culture of experimentation. So once we start bringing in marketing, product, et cetera, and bringing those teams together. But I think, the points I really want to talk about, the culture of experimentation, is within engineering teams. And Elliot, you've had a very good point there about documentation. So I think documentation, and this is something we've seen across quite a few businesses now. So we have seen use cases where, there was a champion within the business, they really got, what experimentation was all about. They went in, they've created this really good implementation. But then 3 months or 6 months down the line, they've just disappeared. They left the business. Nobody knows how it's been implemented and how it should be used. So in my view, the starting point to actually start embedding a level of culture of experimentation is to have documentation in place, okay? So how it's been implemented end to end, what are the different interaction points, and how should it be used as well? So I think that's really the starting point. The next point I want to talk about is, having champions within a business. So not just having a champion, okay? So it really depends on the team structure, how the teams are structured. Okay, do we have multiple products across the team? How many squads? Again, just having a single champion, it does help, especially within small teams. But as the teams are bigger, we really suggest having multiple champions within the team. Okay, so just really understanding what experimentation is about, living and breathing, and ensuring that, should they see an opportunity for embedding a new product as a feature flag or as an experiment to validate, they can actually push that through. The other point I really want to talk about is ownership. Okay, so having ownership of anything that is created within a code base, and it's properly documented. Okay, so again, I have seen use cases where, features have been created within a code base. There's just a few comments in there, this, but, there's no really understanding as to whether there is a dependency attached, what type of feature it is, can they be turned off? So again, having that full ownership of that feature, but also having a process that documents everything, what that feature should do. And Elliot, you've mentioned this before, and I think that's something it should be mentioned more deeply, because that ownership, it's crucial, I think. The other point I really want to talk about is wider enablements. Okay, so starting with champions, I think it's a good starting point, but then how do we start scaling that knowledge and understanding to start creating that culture of experimentation within engineering? Okay, is it just champions? Where do we go next? Should it be product teams, development teams, QA teams? Again, having a strategy to actually start broadening that knowledge, I think it's crucial, I think. And then, from the business considerations, if we've got a good documentation around business consideration, which we talked about, and I talked briefly about, mapping the core processes that different teams use, I think that's really a good starting point for us to start embedding a culture of experimentation within existing processes. So changing processes within existing teams, it's really hard. But if we just make a slight change to the existing process to embed experimentation, it's slightly easier to do. So we always suggest doing a very slow approach, understand the current processes really well, and see where the gaps are to embed experimentation as part of that flow. So I think, those are really the points I really want to talk about, and this is just about culture of experimentation within engineering. It's not an easy task, but I think it's achievable if we have these key steps in place. Yeah.
Yeah, just Elliot, I don't know if you're going to add, but before you do, one thing to go back to the documentation is something that I personally, having worked, I've been in consultancy most of my life and worked mostly with technical people, and I think one of the things I think a technical person, just stereotyping people here really a bit, but one thing that's quite common is that technical people tend to believe that the truth will out, like that they would be judged by the results as opposed to any kind of PR or communication around it. And the example I always use is a client of mine many years ago, we were rolling out client-side testing tool, Before they could buy the tool, they did a really good proof of concept. And at the end of the proof of concept, they wrote up this beautiful 2-page PDF about problem, solution, result. They had pound signs or dollar signs it was on it. And the whole business heard about this really cool tool that could let you test and personalize the experience. And then they did what technical teams tend to do is once they got sign off, they just got head down and started testing. And for the next 2 years, they were doing brilliant testing and it was really, really impactful, but they stopped talking about it. And when I came back to that business 2 years later and we wanted to add another tool that would help them do personalization based on loyalty status, it was, I'll never forget the CIO, I think it was, said that tool is just a cost. It doesn't generate revenue because they've made the mistake of not talking about it. So I think, although you really talk about documentation in terms of handover, I also think in terms of understanding that we can communicate the value that this tool is delivering is critical to getting more investment, right? If we want to keep growing this, we need to be doing, internal PR, which is not something that, technically minded people aren't naturally into shouting about their successes. It's usually, as I say, that's normally driven by they think the proof will be in the pudding. But I think for me personally, it's a real lesson that you have to be putting 5% of your time aside to make sure you write up what you achieved and how that's impacted the business and making sure that's widely known so that next time you want to level up a bit or accelerate or grow something, you've got a good foundation to do that. So sorry, it may be slightly off topic there, but just that triggered a thought. So Elliot, I don't know if you wanted to add more to the culture.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really like what you said there, almost like about being proud of your work. You've got to have buy-in from the whole business, as we've already talked about with server-side testing. You can't do it as one team. You need to have the marketing team working with the tech team, and you'll need to have back-end and front-end teams. So yeah, being proud, like saying that, showing off about the value it brings. It will bring you value in the long run. There'll be difficulties along the way, but you'll end up with a better product, software, website, whatever it is you're optimizing. So yeah, definitely being proud, and then that will help get adoption, get buy-in from the business, so everyone knows the value of it. Something else I'd really talk about, and it's quite a hard one to get people, maybe particularly engineering people, into their head, is be prepared to fail. Accept failure is part of experimentation. Not every project, not every test will work. There will be wasted effort. There's going to be wasted development resource, wasted code. There's going to be a lot of things that don't go right. That is part of experimentation. I mean, people on the line will probably testify that not every test works. A lot of them will fail, and that can be more costly with server-side testing. But it's really about understanding the value of a failed test. So if you've got failed tests, you've known that change. We thankfully we tested it and we didn't do that, and we can learn from that. And at the end of the day, not all of that code will be redundant. You can repurpose it if you've built it correctly, if you've used the flags in the appropriate way. And then in the end, there will be failures, but regardless of what you're doing, the software will be optimized and it will be made better via experimentation. So definitely it's a hard thing to get in your head, but be prepared to fail. This may not work first time. There will be hiccups along the way. So that, along with obviously getting buy-in and then being proud of what you're doing. I love the idea of experimentation champions. My previous company was a GDPR privacy software, and they had the idea of a privacy champion, and that was easy to get adoption of because it was a compliant thing. You had to do it, so if you didn't do it, well, you were going to be fined millions of dollars. So privacy champions were made within every department where someone took ownership of it, and an experimentation champion should be in part of every team, within the marketing, within the development team, within even your PR team. There should be an experimentation champion that part of their KPIs, part of their target, part of their day-to-day goal, just 10% of their work maybe is about experimentation, so that there's that adoption, so that everyone knows it within the business, and so that it stays, it continuously runs and it continuously iterates. Yeah,
really good points. And I was going to add something to that, but before I do, just because we're conscious of time, we did want to put a little bit of time aside at the end to have any questions. So if you've got any questions, everyone who's listening in, if you could pop any questions you have into the chat, and we'll take a look at those and answer. But I think just to add on, and John's already made a good comment about no such thing as a failed experiment, but I think, at risk of laboring this is something that having worked predominantly with marketing teams for a long time in the optimization world, I think it was still a cultural change for people to understand, people, although every CRO agency or every optimization team in the world will tell you that they're data driven. There is still a lot of personal opinion that goes into it. And even if you do truly get your ideas from the data, there's still a lot of yourself that goes into the build of a variation or of a new idea or something. And people can take it very personally, and it's hard when it fails. It's really hard when it fails. And I think that was, I would say I wouldn't say every marketing team's got there, but it's been a journey to educate those people. And now we're talking about development teams, engineering teams, I teams, and a lot more people. And we had a great question last week actually that that asked about, how did the business react to actually things slowing down? I think Josh is actually on the call again today. I think we were talking last week about how, one of the advantages of server side is that actually you can build tests in a more complete full code set, so that actually once you've got a winner, you can push your winners live quicker. Our speaker last week was saying for them that was a big part of their business case, being able to get winners live quicker just was generating incremental revenue. But then the flip of that is that, does that mean you're slowing down the development cycle? And I think that's something that needs to be considered, needs to be included in your decision about which tests should be driven through server side and which side should be client side. I don't think we've really addressed it today, but we don't necessarily say that it's one or the other, that it's probably a combination of both. With a very strong governance roadmap, prioritization framework to support that. And I think actually next week's session, when we're talking a lot more about the execution or the operational side of it, we're going to talk a lot more about that operating model part, which includes having champions and, whether it's a center of excellence or some other operating model that helps drive it, and governance and processes and templated ways of working to really support that. Got one question through from Hans here. Actually, let me change the slide so we know we're on Q&A, so we're all clear. So I'll read it out. While I read it, one of you two can fight over who wants to answer it first. So because of the KPI difference between dev teams and marketing, maybe server-side and client-side testing should go hand in hand, which I think I just touched on slightly there. So what's your opinion? What are your thoughts, either of you?
I mean, I can start answering that by saying, yes, they can. We work with several clients that do have a server-side program and a client-side program. Your client-side, particularly on website, can be doing the smaller, easier changes because the marketing team can do that autonomously. They can just build it, launch it live at scale. Meanwhile, the server-side testing is doing, bigger. There's more structural tests for the bigger wins, whereas the smaller tests are for the smaller wins. And it kind of goes back to the point of, there's a risk of adding experimentation. Server-side experimentation will slow down sort of development resource. But if you align the experimentation to the roadmap, then all the work you're doing for the experimentation will actually lead to the roadmap, and you'll get a better product at the end of it. And so yes, that's if you have a server-side and a client-side tool. The server-side tests can be aligned to the roadmap, continuing with the development of the tool or the software or the website, whereas all the while you're running client-side experiments.
Yeah. I think just to add to that, very good, Elliot. I mean, just to add to that, is just visibility. I think that's going to be key. The last thing you probably want is having a front-end experiment running on a PLP, for example, and a feature all of a sudden going live and breaking that test. So making sure that both platforms can coexist, I think that's key. And, completely support that. We do have a lot of businesses currently using both client-side and server-side, and they coexisting naturally across the website. So I think the foundation to that is just visibility and alignment. And I think that's key.
And I'd add to that, and again, I don't want to keep referring back to the session last week too much for those who weren't there, but we had a client on last week, Stuart from Irish Components, and he made a good point when we were talking about the use case of website performance, page performance. And we just talked a little bit about how he said that the thing is, any tag or any kind of, when you're doing testing, he considers it as a tax. Like when you put any tag on the page, it's going to have an impact on page performance. So you have to weigh up whether it's worth it. What are you going to gain from it? What are you going to learn? How can you positively impact the business to balance out the cost of slowing down the page by a few kilobytes or whatever. And I think that if you extend that thinking into server-side versus client-side testing, or the two of them coexisting, I think to me it really speaks to that prioritization framework. Or I think if you look at most fairly basic experimentation programs, their prioritization framework is pretty much, of the 10 tests that we've got, which one's going to drive the most impact on bottom line, and that's probably the only metric they're looking at. Whereas I think a more sophisticated framework needs to include the cost of building it, the risk that we're going to bring forward by having a negative impact on businesses. Things like the impact, and what we're talking about here, the time it takes to build versus the loss if we end up with a losing variation. And then if you can have a framework there that then helps you say, actually, these three can be delivered via client side, and actually they're going to give us enough cover to go and do the more cool, exciting thing in server side testing. I think absolutely they have to work hand in hand. I think maybe there are use cases and examples where you choose one or the other, but I think generally speaking, I think every client that we work with has both, and it's probably maybe even the whole kind of genesis of this whole webinar series came from having the same conversation with 3 different people about how they adjust their governance model so that the client side and the server side testing don't bump into each other along the way, because they're all talking to the same customer. And there's a point here from Hans, just adding on to that, saying that it should be one team, maybe you're looking all. So yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I can add on to that. I think there's different models, Hans, and I think it's a very good point. Ultimately, that's what businesses should aim to get to. I mean, we do work with some businesses that do have reached that model, that they actually oversee everything that goes across client side, but both server side as well. But we also have some clients that they just have visibility of the development pipelines and the engineering team. They just have visibility of the client side roadmap. So I think that's potentially a good starting point, just opening up that visibility to those teams and then working your way through to get to a unified view of everything, all the experiments, I would say, across the business.
Yeah. I just to add to, when we talk about champions, I think we had an interesting discussion. So this morning I was talking with the guys who will be on next week's webinar, and we talked about operating models. And I personally, I always wince a bit when people talk about centers of excellence, because it, like, everyone now seems to default to the center of excellence being the only operating model, which I don't think is true for every business. I think there's different models depending on the dynamics of brand and markets, etc. But actually, I think there's a strong argument for, when server side is new, for the center of excellence model being the most appropriate to drive it forwards at the beginning, at least. And partly because, to Hans's point and to what you were saying, Nelson, that you've got champions then who kind of own and can sort of direct traffic, and also be a champion for making sure that this is going in the right direction and handle those kind of objections. I think that is it. Are there any more questions? I think there's as we said at the top, or said at the beginning, this is quite a tricky topic to make generic, because I think a lot of the technical considerations for rolling out server side really depends on who asked for it in the first place, what your tech stack is. I think, when I'm with Nelson on some of the kickoffs we have with some of our clients, that there's a lot of understanding the tech stack, how things operate right now, what's the release cycle, etc., and things like that. So it's very difficult to make some content that's interesting and useful for everyone. So hopefully we touched on a few points that are relevant. But both Nelson and Elliot both said that they'd be happy to follow up with people individually afterwards if you've got any questions following today. There is a recording of the session, so we'll send you an email following up after this, just to give you access if there's anything that we said brilliantly that you want to revisit. But also, we'll ask you some feedback as well about what we could do differently. We might revisit this and do another session at some point and cover a few more topics in a bit more detail. That's it really for today. I think we're just to remind you that we've got 3 other webinars, a total of 3 webinars. So we're in the middle here on webinar 2, talk about best practice of implementation. Next week, we're talking much more about the execution and how you kind of roll that out your business and enable it within your business. And if you're interested, if you weren't involved last week in the business case side of it, we have videos of that if you want to, or alternatively reach out to us and we'd be happy to talk directly. So I think that's it really. I think we don't seem to have any more questions coming through. So Nelson, Elliot, you must have answered everyone's questions brilliantly. So thanks for that. Appreciate your time, everybody. Hopefully it's been useful, and hope to speak to you all again in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.